MH370 was a Malaysian Airlines flight originating in Kuala Lumpur. Its destination was Beijing, China. On the night of March 8, 2014, while flying over the South China Sea, all of its communication equipment was shut off, making it invisible to air traffic control. An hour later, Malaysian military radar tracked the flight heading northwest up the Malacca Strait. Flight 370 was never seen again. I'm Ed Denzel, and this is Unfound. Stubbornness is a quirk of human nature. I wouldn't say it's the worst of what humans can dish out, but it certainly can drive us nuts. I'd say it's a trait that can sow the seeds of animosity and resentment over a long period of time, and there's nothing that can irk us more than someone who can't see things our own way, even though the truth is right in front of that other person's face. Of course, it's also a flaw of our own nature, that we don't see that same hard-headedness in ourselves. In fact, I think all of us walk around thinking we're fairly open-minded, when probably we're not. We're just as likely to defend mistakes and wrong thinking as much as anyone else. So where am I going with this? Well, if this stubbornness you're running into in your life is with your mother-in-law, your boss, your neighbor, whoever, and may I say, the problems they may have with your own hard-headedness, that's something that probably you're all just going to have to work out. But what if that stubbornness, closed-mindedness, obstinacy, mental myopia is what is keeping 239 people from being found? What then? Because in the disappearance of Flight 370, my own thoughts regarding this case have been challenged, and it's only been within the last 6 months that I've personally had to get past my own closed-mindedness and open my mind to other possibilities. And I hope after listening to this episode, you'll open your minds as well, because it seems the authorities and governments who continue to look for Flight 370 will not. And now, a summary of the disappearance. Malaysia Airlines Flight 370, registered as 9M MRO, was a scheduled international passenger flight that disappeared on March 8, 2014, while flying from Kuala Lumpur International Airport, Malaysia, to its destination, Beijing International Airport in China. The aircraft, a Boeing 777-200ER, last made voice contact with air traffic control at 1:19 a.m. Malaysia time when it was over the South China Sea, less than an hour after takeoff. The aircraft disappeared from air traffic controllers' radar screens at 1:22 a.m., 3 minutes later. However, Flight 370 was still tracked on military radar as it deviated westward from its planned flight path and crossed back over the Malay Peninsula. It left the range of Malaysian military radar at 2:22 a.m. while over the Andaman Sea, 200 nautical miles northwest of Malaysia. The aircraft was carrying 12 Malaysian crew members and 227 passengers from 15 nations. The multinational search effort for the aircraft was the largest and most expensive in aviation history. The search began in the Gulf of Thailand and the South China Sea, where the aircraft's signal was last detected on secondary surveillance radar, but was soon extended to the Strait of Malacca and the Andaman Sea. Analysis of the satellite communications between the aircraft and Inmarsat's satellite network concluded that the flight continued until at least 8:19 a.m. Malaysia time, flying south into the southern Indian Ocean. Australia took charge of the search on March 17, 2014, when the search moved to the southern Indian Ocean. From October 2014 to January 2017, a comprehensive survey of 46,000 square miles yielded no evidence of the aircraft. But pieces of debris were found on the coast of Africa and on Indian Ocean islands off the coast of that continent, the first discovered on July 29, 2015 on Reunion Island. However, the bulk of the aircraft has still not been located on the sea floor. The interview for this episode is with Jeff Wise, aviation author and expert. Unfound News. I hope you all enjoyed the special Monday episode in which I interviewed Cambo Ford from True Crime Island. Like when I interviewed Nate Hale from The Conspirators, I wanted all of you to hear from a show that was within the genre of true crime, but is different from Unfound. Cambo and I had fun with the interview, and I'm sure we'll continue to keep tabs on each other's programs. The Unfound website continues to be built. It will have all the episodes completed to this point, then it will be updated weekly. It will also have the Unfound Twitter and Instagram feeds, along with pictures of the victims and summaries of the cases. Eventually, the website will also have a store, and I think you're going to find it very interesting what I'll be doing with Unfound merchandise. Progress is also being made on the Unfound book, by the way. Finally, Unfound continues to break records on a weekly basis. All the credit goes to the listeners who are spreading the word about this program. I really don't know if there is any way I'll ever be able to return the favor to all of you. I promise I'll continue to do my best every week, and I'll never take your listenership for granted. Where you can find Unfound: on Facebook, the Unfound Podcast Discussion Group. There's over 1,200 members there now. On Twitter, @Unfound Podcast. On Instagram, @Unfound Podcast. Email the program, unfoundpodcast@gmail.com. You can subscribe at Podomatic and iTunes. And please mention Unfound at WebSleuths, Reddit, podcasts we listen to, and all other true crime websites and forums. I'm so happy to have on this episode of Unfound Jeff Wise. Jeff, welcome to Unfound.
Hey, thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
Jeff, tell the listeners a little bit about yourself, how you got into aviation, and maybe some of your credentials.
Okay, sure. Well, I'm a journalist. I've been a freelance writer for, about 25 years now. And I got my pilot's license about 15 years ago. And so I had been writing about adventure and travel, some science. But once I got my pilot's license, I got increasingly into writing about airplanes and flying. And that turned into, one of the things about flying that people are most interested in is, of course, crashes and the more mysterious ones seem to generate the most interest. I wrote a lot about Air France 447, which was the greatest mystery prior to the disappearance of Malaysian Airlines MH370. And so then I wound up, written for Popular Mechanics, New York Magazine, Men's Journal, lots of other places as well. Once MH370 disappeared, I found myself going on CNN many times a day for about 4 months. As you know, it was a case that pretty much obsessed CNN, and they kind of covered nothing else for a little while. So I got kind of sucked into that, and I've been following it ever since. I have a website, jeffwise.net, where where I post some of my research, and people respond to it. Some people post their own research. And there's kind of a very active online community of people who are technically knowledgeable about the case and are trying to push it forward. As you probably know, the authorities have suspended their efforts. We're waiting for a final report from the Australians, which they said they're going to release in the third quarter. And it's pretty much winding down, but there's still a lot to be done. And I think that actually the case will be solved by independent researchers.
We should note that you've also been, I've seen you personally because I'm a big fan of the show. You've been on the Mayday show too.
Yes,
as a
I have.
spokesman, as a person who is an expert on aviation and aviation crashes. You've been on a few episodes of that show as well.
Yeah, I have. I haven't done one lately, but they would call me up from time to time and have me go be a talking head.
Talking about Flight 370, do you remember where you were when you heard that it disappeared, and what were your immediate reactions? And do you think a person as yourself in the aviation industry maybe reacts to it a little bit different than the rest of the population?
I don't remember where I was when I first heard about it, but you have to recall that when it first transpired, it didn't seem like a particularly remarkable case. I mean, it was a big potential tragedy, and a lot of people were going to die. But planes do go down, from time to time, and it seemed like there was a number of things it could be. Just remember, the plane took off from Kuala Lumpur March 8th, 2014. It was heading for Beijing. It was supposed to be about a 6-hour flight. 40 minutes into the flight, it vanished from radar screens. And it didn't reappear as it should have. And so, it could have been in-flight fire. It could have been some kind of mechanical failure. It could have been any of a number of things. And there was an expectation that it would unfold the way these things generally do. Debris would be found, black boxes would be found, and the authorities would be able to piece it together. Obviously, that didn't happen.
So that was the initial thoughts of the public, but then we get more information. And when did this new information, how long after the flight disappeared, did this new information come out, and what did it say?
I like to call MH370 the triple disappearing airplane because it really effectively vanished 3 times. The first time when it disappeared from air traffic control screens, and that happened because the plane was actively transmitting information about its location and speed to air traffic control systems, which are automatically, recorded and displayed on the flight controller's screens. That equipment was turned off, and once that happened, the air traffic controllers couldn't see it anymore. However, and that was immediate. Then, so that was immediate. That's what was known first, that the plane had vanished from these screens. Later, a few days later, as I recall, the military piped up and said, "Oh, hey, by the way, once it disappeared from your radar, your air traffic control secondary radar screens, as it's called, we saw it on our primary radar screens. This is the passive radar that sort of, it's almost like a flashlight beaming radiation into the sky, detecting the radiation that's bounced off of the plane." And so the plane doesn't have to be actively transmitting anything. The military can passively see this plane flying through the air. We saw it turn around, do essentially a 180, fly back over the Malaysian peninsula, up the Malacca Straits, over towards the Andaman Islands, and then it disappeared again. So this is the second disappearance. And so the search for the plane's debris shifted from the South China Sea to the Andaman Sea on the other side of the Malay Peninsula. And that's where it stood for about a week. And then Inmarsat piped up and said, "Oh, hey, by the way, we actually looked into our database, and it turns out that we recorded signals received by our satellite for up to 6 hours after it disappeared from primary radar. And then it vanished again. So that's the third vanishing. So, this was why it became such a huge news story, because it wasn't just that the plane crashed, but that these incredible revelations kept turning up, and the revelations kept continuing. So that a little bit after that, then it turns out that the Malaysians the Inmarsat and the engineers there had come up with a new mathematical way of analyzing the data that they had. And they were able to determine something about where the plane had gone. And the math was a little bit fuzzy, and they didn't quite understand it perfectly. But they figured that it had either gone into the southern Indian Ocean or up to Kazakhstan. And then with this math, they then determined that, in fact, it had to have gone into the Southern Ocean. Then the Malaysian Prime Minister said, okay, that everyone has to be dead because the math says that it's in the Southern Indian Ocean. There's no way to survive down there. And so this was a really extraordinary turn of events, in my estimation, that for the first time in history, as far as I'm aware, math, just based on purely on mathematics, this plane full of people had been declared dead. And of course, now, as you might imagine, the passengers weren't really satisfied by this. The public hadn't been explained to the public how this math worked.
Right.
And so the public was just being told, hey, trust us. We've done this math. It's right. And so stop wondering if they're alive or not, because they're not alive. This outraged. There was like riots in Beijing where a lot of the relatives of the passengers lived. And So it went on, and there was more further revelations, more shoes to drop. And of course, now here we are 3 years later, and they've spent over $150 million, and they have not found the plane, which they assured the public, we're going to spend this money, but then we're going to find the plane. Didn't happen. So there's a lot. So it just, the mind boggles. The story just, it's this, you couldn't have dreamed up a more compelling, fascinating, ongoing, baffling, maddening story than MH370. And unfortunately, the public and the media have kind of thrown up their hands and said, we don't really understand what's going on. We hear these crazy theories coming out from time to time. We just don't know what to make of it. And the authorities haven't really helped because, from time to time they say, oh, we figured something else up. Now we know where it is. But then they kind of consistently don't find it.
If we could go back for just a moment to talk about Inmarsat, for the average person who maybe isn't that familiar with how a jet works and how it beams information, is this something like for maybe the common person to, if they were to go something like flightradar24.com, does that get its information from this company Inmarsat and its satellites? Is that how that works? Just like I said, for the common person who isn't a pilot and just flies like once a year.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and the answer is no. The information does not come from Inmarsat, and people. There's kind of an ongoing tendency for people to look at Flight Radar 24 data and see strange things happening and say, wow, I see UFOs, or I see some physically impossible behavior, or I see something that the press isn't telling us about. The thing you need to know about Flight Radar 24 is that it's wildly inaccurate. They get their information from sources that aren't really vetted, that aren't really that reliable. There's nothing wrong with it. I'm not criticizing it, but it's like one of these things like for entertainment purposes only. Like, don't use this to write an article about it or to assume that something actually is happening. It's just very, very unreliable. Now, the Inmarsat data is something completely different. What happens is airlines subscribe to this service whereby, just like you would subscribe to a cell phone service, they are able to communicate with the ground by sending signals up to space, and then it's being back down, and then it's routed around, and eventually it winds up going, the message or the telephone call goes where it's supposed to go. Now, it turns out that this particular subscription that that Malaysia Airlines had with Inmarsat was such that every half hour the plane would sort of send an update, just kind of saying where it is and what's going on with the plane, in case there was some problem or maybe one of the engines was acting up. They'd be able to sort of get that message automatically routed through. All those systems were turned off when the plane vanished from the air traffic control radar screens. The plane went electronically dark. What was really interesting was that the system, the satellite communication system, was turned back on about 40 minutes after that. So the plane had disappeared. It had disappeared twice. It had vanished once from secondary radar screens, the air traffic control. Yeah. It had then vanished from the primary radar screens. This is the military radar. Then 3 minutes after that, boom, it's back online. It's back communicating with the satellite. But what's really interesting is that the whole suite of electronics hadn't been turned back on. The part of the electronics that was sending messages saying, here we are, this is where we are, this is what we're doing, that didn't come back online. All that came back online was the signal between the plane and the satellite. Now, you can imagine, like, if you turn on your cell phone, the cell phone connects to the nearest tower and says, hey, I'm here, and it's waiting. It's waiting for an incoming call. It's waiting for an outgoing call. Nothing was actually sent. So nobody, they could have used a telephone to make a call. They didn't. Actually, 2 phone calls came in, but nobody answered them. It just rang and rang. So you've got a very peculiar situation. And so myself and a few other people who follow this obsessively and talk about it online tried to answer the question, how is it possible for this system to come back online? Can it have it accidentally? Is it possible, say, that the plane, enters into a steep bank and then the antenna isn't able to communicate with the satellite for a little while? To make a long story short, it seems that this could not happen accidentally. That the only way that the planes could stop communicating with the satellite and then start communicating with the satellite again is that somebody had to actively turn off and turn back on the system.
And the only way somebody can do that, though, is you can't do that from the cockpit. You actually have to go down into the electronics bay, which is actually under the cockpit. There's like a trap door outside
Right.
of the cockpit to get down in there.
Right. One of the really interesting things that turned up as we delved into the details of this mystery is that there's a hatch in the front of the business class cabin, which is it's in between the galley and one of the lavatories. And it's unlocked usually on most airlines. And you pull back a carpet and there's this handle, and you pull the handle and there's a little staircase, and you go down and you're in the belly of the plane's electronics and equipment bay. And you can essentially, if you know what you're doing, take over control of the plane, and you can change the signals that are sent to the satellite. Now, it is possible to turn off this system from the cockpit if you know what you're doing. There's actually two ways to turn the power to the satellite. It's called the satellite data unit. That's the system that communicates with the satellite. There's two ways to do that. One is from the cockpit, one is from the EE bay. Both require pretty sophisticated knowledge of the plane's electronic systems. And a few months after the plane disappeared, some of the people that were working on this went to a top-level flight simulator facility where one of the big American carriers, trains its pilots, and went into one of these super realistic simulators and asked the people who run the simulator, how do you turn off the satellite data unit? And their answer was, what? What are you talking about?
They didn't even know that you could do it. They didn't know that was possible.
The average pilot does not know what a satellite data unit is, let alone know how to turn it off and turn it back on again. So the point that I keep trying to drive home to people is the mere fact that this thing was turned off and turned back on again implies a certain level of sophistication of whoever carried this thing out. And by the way, just by saying that, I've implied what I should just say outright, which is that there's absolutely no evidence. In fact, there's strong evidence against the idea that the plane suffered some kind of an accident, that there was some kind of malfunction or a fire or something unintentional. It seems quite clear that whatever happened to this plane was done by people because they wanted to do it. Somebody took this plane. This was not an accident. This is a point that
let's maybe hold off to that till a little bit later because you get into that in your book, and I definitely want to talk to you about that. But but maybe just real quickly, the pilot of the plane or the co-pilot of Flight 370, is there anything in their histories that would show that either one of them would have known how to do that? Just real very quickly, anything in their histories?
No.
Zero.
Nothing in their history would show that they would know how to do that.
Okay. Speaking of the data, and I don't want to get too much into the weeds on this, but there are two different types of data that were analyzed, like you talked about mathematics trying to locate where the plane might have gone down. It's BFO data and BTO data. If you can maybe simply explain the difference of them, but also how they're supposed to both be fairly reliable, but they tell people different things. Can you go into that maybe a little bit?
Yeah, I'll try to keep it real simple. The BTO is called burst timing offset. And basically, it tells you how far the plane is from the satellite. And when you plot that out on a map, and there's 7 of these. And so we have 7, and they're about an hour apart. And we know, so at each of these moments, how far the plane was from the satellite. And you can plot this on the ground as an arc. And so this arc runs from Kazakhstan in the north down through Thailand. You can imagine a big circle that kind of cuts through Indonesia and then winds up in the ocean far to the southwest of Australia. So like thousands of miles out in the ocean. And because of some other things, having to do with the plane's how the autopilot works and so forth. It's a mathematical ledger domain. It turns out that the plane, based on this data alone, the plane either wound up in the remote, far southern Indian Ocean or up in Kazakhstan at either end of these arcs. So that's the BTO data. And the BTO data is very easy to understand, and it's quite reliable, and it's quite accurate. So that it's like the arc is accurate to about plus or minus 10 kilometers, or about plus or minus 5 miles, more or less, 6
Which is
miles.
very considerable considering how big the Earth is.
Yeah, it's really quite accurate. And so when if you're going to go look in the southern Indian Ocean, it gives you a pretty good idea of where you should look. Parenthetically, I should add that some other data. Well, okay, let me move on to BFO,
Sure.
burst frequency offset. Now, this is a little bit harder to understand, but as the plane is moving around relative to the satellite, its frequency is changing. If you've ever like heard a train whistle as it goes past, like as the train's coming towards you, it's the frequency increases, and then it goes as the train passes, you perceive a lower frequency. Would a
good example of that be maybe people are familiar with like a police siren as it's coming toward you, and it kind of goes into a minor key as it goes away from you. It goes
Absolutely.
down into something like that. Okay, great.
It's called Doppler shift.
Sure.
And what makes it complicated is that the plane's this satellite data unit that I mentioned was designed to compensate for that, so that it was actively changing its frequency so that the satellite would not perceive a change in frequency, but that algorithm that was used to generate that change of frequency was wrong. There were some problems with how it was implemented, which is a good thing, because due to these flaws, scientists were able to go back and extract some information about how the plane was moving from this BFO data. Now, it's not simple to explain what it tells you, but the most important thing that it tells you is that the plane couldn't have gone north; it must have gone south. And so that's why the prime minister said, "Oh, the passengers are all dead." It was because of this fancy mathematics derived from the BFO data. Okay. But it also could be used, and it was hoped that, in fact, in the first months after the plane disappeared, Inmarsat scientists believed that by combining the BFO and the BTO data, they would essentially be able to create a kind of XY intersection, so they could pinpoint more or less where the plane was, and it would be pretty simple to just go down and find it. Mm-hmm. It later turned out that the BFO data was fuzzier than they realized, and they wound up not using it for that purpose. But in the first months after the plane disappeared, there was a lot of excitement about figuring out how the BFO values were derived and using that to pinpoint the plane.
Okay, so the BFO data, somewhat reliable, but the BTO data, very reliable. The problem with the BTO, data is it shows that the plane could have gone in two different directions, two totally different directions.
Exactly, right. It's a very binary situation where it either went here or it went there. But as I said, but as time went by and the scientists lost faith in their ability to use the BFO data to pinpoint where the plane actually went on these arcs, they came up with an alternative solution, which was it had to do with Bayesian analysis of different possibilities where the plane could have gone based on its available autopilot settings. And that's how they wind up deciding where to spend all their $150 million to look for the plane. Yeah.
And let's talk about that. I guess we could say we're in the minority. You were in the minority. I wouldn't say from the beginning, but at some point, and I know it's you write about it in your book, you were kind of in the minority compared to all these other aviation people. These other people were pretty sure that the plane was going to be found in either one of those two areas in the South Indian Ocean using the BFO data and the BTO data. You, however, weren't as hopeful. Can you tell me why that was? And you had a couple stories about what went on behind the scenes maybe that you can share. Share.
Yeah, I was in kind of a minority of one on this case, kind of from the get-go. I spent a lot of time writing about Air France 447, and I was really struck from the very beginning, by a very peculiar aspect of MH370, which was that I mentioned that all the electronics were turned off on the plane. Some people thought, oh, maybe it was like a fire, like caused the electronics to burn out. But it was very interesting to me that the plane was leaving Malaysian airspace, and it passed a waypoint called Igari. 6 seconds after it passed Igari, the plane went dark. 6 seconds. Now, there's a thing that happens when you leave one air traffic control area and then you enter another air traffic control area. There's a kind of a gap. And during that gap, nobody's really responsible for you. Nobody's really paying attention to you. Air France 447 was crossing a huge stretch of ocean, and so this gap was very large. And so it was actually in this gap for several hours, so it was a long time before anyone noticed that the plane was missing. But it took people a long time to sense that the plane had gone down. Malaysian Airlines MH370 only had about 3 minutes. But during that 3 minutes, that's when it went dark and it turned around. And it wasn't just some random time during this 3 minutes. It was immediately, like 6 seconds after it entered this gap, it turned around and did this mysterious behavior. This seemed incredibly suspicious to me. This seemed to me that a highly motivated act. And I should point out that once they turned around, they flew at high speed. Like they actually accelerated from the speed that they were doing, and they hightailed it. This seemed to me to indicate motivation. Motivation to do what? If you're going to fly into the Southern Indian Ocean, you're going to die. And people do commit suicide in planes, but what it usually looks like is that people point the plane straight down and end it quickly. You're not going to, like, if you're going to shoot yourself in the head, you're not going to, like, somehow, rig the trigger to some contraption that, like, kills you 6 hours from now. Like,
Yes.
who wants to, like, prolong their agony? So it seemed to me very, 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 very suspicious. So I thought there was some kind. So I very quickly, and then I was really in the minority on that. And so this whole thing sounded very fishy to me. And then I kind of was in the minority again when about 2 months after the plane disappeared, they started. This was a month. It was after the first month, or was it 2 months? Anyway, it's been a long time. They detected these pings, these different kind of ping, these acoustic pings from the seabed, because they had given up hope of finding the wreckage. They'd been searching for the wreckage on the surface of the sea, and they couldn't find anything. So they put these hydrophones in the water, and lo and behold, the first time they put the hydrophones in the water, they start detecting these pings, and everyone said, except me, "Oh, hey, we found the plane." And I remember being on CNN, and one of the correspondents from Australia was saying that his sources within the officialdom in Australia were saying, quote, they've as good as found it. Like, they consider, like, it's case closed. We've heard the pings, we've found it. And I said, actually, the frequency that they detect these pings at is wrong, and it's only a little bit wrong, but it's too wrong. And the physical location of where you detected these pings is too far apart. The detection range isn't that great. And so we almost got into, like, a fist fight backstage after one of these segments on CNN, not between me and the guy, but between another person who agreed with me that there was something wrong with it. There was an undersea explorer who was like, it's not possible that the frequency could be this far off. And so, but this is, like, really emblematic of the story as a whole, where you've got these really widely varying pattern differences of belief between different so-called experts. And I remember Bill Nye the Science Guy was on at one point during this particular segment of the mystery, and he was saying, "Oh yeah, there's this thing called refraction that changes the frequency of sound and light waves." And I'm like, "Are you kidding me? You're the science guy, and you're telling me that refraction changes frequency? That's just absolute nonsense."
No, of course it doesn't.
And so it was frustrating. It's been frustrating for me because I feel like the media has done a terrible job accurately describing what's going on with search. The authorities have done a terrible job, and the public has done a terrible job. You've had all sorts of people who kind of get crazy theories in their head and start, running around the internet trying to propose their theory, which is not grounded in anything. The main takeaway that I would like to say to anyone who's interested in this case is that this is a deeply technical scientific mystery.
It is. Sure, that's absolutely true. You read the book, you read your book, that is absolutely true. Yeah.
Well, thank you. I mean, I was thinking about this the other day, and like an analogy that comes to mind is like, imagine you go to Yosemite and like you see this cliff wall, and it's like this sheer rock face, and you look at it, and like at a coarse grain level of understanding, it seems impossible. It's like this is and indeed for like 99.999% of the population, it's an unclimbable wall. It's literally impassable. But if you go up to it and you really examine it closely, you'll see that there are tiny little finger holes. And if you start climbing, if you have this skill and the knowledge and this physical strength, you can grab onto these little finger holes and go up it, and you'll find another finger hold and another toe hold. And amazingly, it's possible to climb this wall. And I think MH370 is kind of an example of that, where it's like at a gross level, at a coarse grain level, it is an unsolvable mystery. But if you approach it carefully and meticulously and look at it, it actually turns out that there are finger holds, and you can carefully climb up this wall, and you get somewhere. It turns out that these assumptions that people make turn out not to be true. And I remember particularly being amazed when, by asking the right questions, it turned out that the satellite data unit had been turned off and turned back on again, which was really overlooked by almost everybody. But also the fact that if you went up to any airline captain, I know a lot of airline pilots because I fly recreationally, and a lot of airline pilots also fly recreationally. And every time I'd say to somebody, how do you reboot the SDU? And they'd all look at me and say, what's an SDU? This is not something that they're trained to do. It's not something that they're supposed to do. It's something that the airline actually doesn't want them to do. So, but there was one of the most popular books that was written about the mystery of MH370. I had lunch with this woman, and she's like, I don't understand the BFO data. It's like beyond my ken.
Then how can she write a book about Flight 370 if she doesn't understand that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm like, if you don't understand the BFO data, you have no business even like weighing in on this topic. But she had done some other reporting, and it turned out there were one of the planes in the fleet had problems with a windshield at some point. So she spun up this whole theory about the windshield and how the depressurization and hypoxia, and it just, it doesn't, you have to, like I said, it's like climbing that wall in Yosemite. You have to look for where the cracks are. You can't just make big assumptions about, I don't know much about climbing walls, but maybe there's an elevator.
Do you think that this reeks of opportunism? It's so popular, so people are going to write a book so they can make a couple bucks out of it, even if the data isn't totally true?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an element to that. I think there's an element of people overestimating their own expertise or the applicability of their own expertise, and I think people feel entitled to weigh in. I think everyone they say, I don't know, I shouldn't use bad language, but like everyone's got one, everyone's got an opinion.
Right. We should mention the title of your book, because I want to mention something about I want to talk about when you started writing it, and also the search that was done. The book is, of course, called The Plane That Wasn't There. When did you start writing that, and what was that in relation to when the search started? And I also want to ask you, were you a little nervous when that search started? You had put yourself out there with this theory that the plane wasn't going to be found and everything, and they start the search. Were there days that you woke up saying, boy, I hope I'm proven that I'm not wrong?
Oh my God, my ass was so hanging in the wind. It was so hanging in the wind. And it wasn't just, I was going on TV like 4 or 5 times a day sometimes, and I was saying, I don't think the acoustic pingers they're not going to find it. It's not there. And it was just, I felt like morally compelled to say, like, this is not what you're saying is not true.
Sure.
And this is not what they really wanted to hear on CNN. But and so, yeah, I mean, I could have been proven wrong at any moment. But I started to think about my alternative explanation really hardcore in June of 2014, and the search hadn't the
So
seabed
it's
search hadn't
only
started.
like 3 months in then, very shortly, 3 months in.
I really vividly remember a guy named Mike Exner, who is a member of the independent group, who does not at all agree with me about my theory. On the contrary, he's been a very vocal supporter of the official line.
Okay.
But he's also very knowledgeable about these systems, and I remember him explaining to me how the satellite data unit works and how the frequency precompensation algorithm works, and I realized, oh my God, this plane they could have spoofed the BFO data, and so we can't trust it. I mean, and this is the thing that to this day I've like multiple times asked the official investigators. How do you know that the BFO data wasn't spoofed? How do you know somebody didn't go down into the unlocked hatch of the electronics equipment bay and alter the equipment to make it look like it was going south, but actually was going north? Right. And they've never addressed the question. They've never answered. Well, the answer that they gave me was, we assume the data was good. And it's pretty strange because they spent all of this money. And oh my God,
$150 million in United States dollars.
I mean, I should emphasize, Amazon gave me some money for my Kindle single, and I got some money from New York Magazine for writing an article about it. But apart from that, like, I've gotten nothing. And it's like, it's been kind of a financial hardship because I got so obsessed with this case that I was spending way too much time doing this instead of work that I get paid for. People think, oh, you're just saying this because you want to you're just being greedy. I'm like, greedy? They spent $150 million. Somebody has $150 million in their pockets because of the official theory. I have no money in my pockets apart from what I just mentioned for my theory. But
it's hell to be right sometimes, isn't it, Jeff?
I can just imagine my wife rolling her eyes at that idea. But I wish I had a tiny fraction of that $150 million for all my hard work. But it doesn't matter. I mean, the point just being, it's incredible to me that they've never even addressed. They've never said, I said, like, even just tell me this is why we know it couldn't have been spoofed. Not just it's unlikely or it's really, really hard. Here's the thing I will acknowledge right up front. If this spoof was done, it was a feat of incredible sophistication. It's like, I would liken it to putting a man on the moon or the Hiroshima bomb. It's a mind-blowing achievement. But I think, and a lot of people say, well, they couldn't have pulled it off. It's beyond their capability. And I would say, you'd be surprised what people are capable of doing.
Can we talk about that a little later? I want to get to the
Sure,
flaw.
yeah,
I want to get to the other part of that, the part that did happen after you started writing your book. And then because finally some wreckage did start appearing on the shores of Africa. Talk a little bit about that. And what does the wreckage say? What does the debris say? Everything about that.
So I came out with my Kindle single. I came up with an article in New York Magazine and then a Kindle single around the same time. Basically, I went public in first quarter of 2015, saying that the plane isn't in the southern hemisphere. And then it was sort of starting to get some traction. I have to say, like, people were saying, this plane disappeared. There's not a single trace of it. All we have is this math. This guy's saying that the math could be wrong. Maybe we should pay attention to this. And then at the end of July 2015, this is a day I remember vividly. Okay. This piece of a piece of the plane finally turned up. Now remember, they'd spent months searching for it from the air, searching for it from ships. They hadn't found anything at the time of the crash or shortly after the crash. But then a year and a half later, or 15 months later, this piece washes up. It's discovered by a beach cleanup crew on the island of Reunion, which is a French possession in the Western Indian Ocean.
Is it like a little north of Madagascar, right?
It's east of
East of
Madagascar.
Madagascar. Okay, east of Madagascar. Okay.
So a piece drifting from the eastern southern Indian Ocean would get there first before it got to Madagascar.
Okay.
And it's a big old chunk of plane. It's about like, I don't know, 6 or 8 feet long, and it takes about 6 guys to pick it up and carry it away. It's covered in barnacles, these marine organisms that grow on things that drift in the open ocean. And it's whisked off to France, and the French do some analysis of it. They don't release the analysis, but some of this analysis gets leaked, and so we have a little bit of information about it. But for most people, this is like, okay, case closed. It's definitely in the southern Indian Ocean. Here's this piece that washed up, and so Jeff Wise is definitely wrong, and that's it. Of course, my thinking is, well, okay, I'm probably wrong. I'll admit that I've had egg on my face before, but let's look at this thing. Like, let's just assume because for months we've been sort of wondering, if somebody did hijack this plane and take it, if the math is wrong, if the plane wound up going somewhere else, then somebody could take a piece of it and put it on a beach.
Sure.
And that would be a really obvious and sort of fairly easy way to just keep the game going. And some people had even suggested that this was evidence against my theory that no debris had turned up, because it would be such an obvious thing for anyone with nefarious intent to do. So anyway, with being skeptical, as I was, I started to dig around and try to figure out, does this flaperon look the way it should? And so I spent an awful lot of time talking to people who are experts in drifting debris, the organisms that live on drifting debris. And there was something very quickly that...
What is a flaperon? Just real quickly, for your average listener out there, how would you describe a flaperon to your average person who flies once a year?
Sure. So, if you've ever sat on a plane and you notice that as you're taking off and landing, there are these bits of metal on the back of the wing that move up and down. And there's flaps, and the flaps are something that you deploy on landing so that the plane can land slower. There's also these things called ailerons that move up and down, and that tells the plane to bank left or right. And the flaperon is sort of a combination of flap and aileron, hence the name. Okay. But so it's a piece of metal that sticks out into the airstream, and it helps to control the plane.
Okay.
So it was broken in ways that seemed, hard to explain. And what really struck me was that in one of these leaked French reports, no, I should back up. It was before the report was leaked, but very early on, it was stated by the French that the piece had floated fully immersed. And this immediately made my ears perk up, because things don't float immersed. Things float either at the surface or they sink. You either float or you sink. And if you've ever scuba dived, you've experienced this, where it's actually pretty hard to stay floating stable in the middle of the water column.
Really work your BCU. Really,
you got it.
Really
got it.
To get it just right to stay in the middle. Yes.
Yeah, you'll know every time you take in a breath, you start to rise, and every time you breathe out, you start to sink, if you're perfectly balanced. Obviously, an inert piece of metal can't do this. It either has positive. You can even imagine something having like a 0.00000 neutral buoyancy, but then things are going to happen, like barnacles start to grow on it, and that makes it heavier and it sinks. So the fact that this really piqued my curiosity, and I said, okay, how is it possible? So I looked at the pictures, and I could see what they meant. The flaperon was covered on every surface in barnacles. The barnacle is called Lepus, genus Lepus. It's called a goose barnacle. There's different species of goose barnacle that live in that part of the world, and I think it was determined to be Lepus anatifera. And I wound up reaching out to, there's only about 6 people in the world who study these things in a serious way. And so I learned a lot about the lifestyle. At first, I thought that the barnacles were too small to be that old, but it turns out that there's complicating factors that maybe they could have like been eaten by a sea turtle and then grown back or something. So that turned out to be less have less evidentiary value than I suspected. But what was interesting was that the most interesting thing was that the flatbron was completely covered in these things that only grow and live underwater. And so if you ever go down to the ocean and you find like a floating buoy or something, the barnacles will be living on the part of that object that are underwater. They won't be living above the waterline for obvious reasons. What they live by, they're like fish. Mm-hmm. They need to breathe. They need water to breathe. Yeah. They gather their food from the water. It doesn't make sense for them to be living on top of a dry surface where they're going to get blasted by radiation from the sun, and it's pretty obvious, right?
Okay.
Well, what was really interesting was that the French were baffled because based on the distribution of barnacles, the piece must have floated immersed, which I said is impossible. But when they put it in the tank to test how it floated half sticking up out of the water. And so they were like, well, okay, how do you reconcile? They can't. They could not reconcile the flotation test with the barnacle distribution. So when they decided to do an analysis of how the winds and the waves would have carried the flatbron, they had to do two simulations, one floating high and one floating submersed. And they came up with two different results. And interestingly, the Australians have never acknowledged this difficulty. The French only acknowledged it in a secret report that was not intended for distribution. The Australians just ignored it, and they based their drift models on the flotation tests. So to me, this is like, okay, this is highly problematic, that you've got a piece which floated in an ostensibly impossible way. So can we, this to me is a red flag. It's not probative in any sense, but it says, okay, something might be going on here. And then then a few months later, other debris started to turn up, and it looked quite different. And altogether, over the span of about 6 months, or maybe a little longer, altogether, a little bit over 20 pieces turned up. And it's hard to have an exact figure because some of them look like airplane parts, but it's hard to really tell. But I think what's most interesting to note is that most of these pieces were found by one person. This person is named Blaine Allen Gibson, and he'd been roaming around the Indian Ocean basin for a couple of years, or at least a year by this point, sort of on his own dime, just walk around talking to people, kind of spinning different theories that didn't really have much scientific basis or plausibility, but that he's a guy who'd kind of been on searches around the world looking for the lost Ark of the Covenant, investigating some Mayan mysteries and stuff. So he was kind of a Discovery Channel kind of guy who was interested in this stuff, and nobody else who deliberately went looking for pieces ever found a piece of this plane. Blaine Allen Gibson found his first piece 20 minutes after he first started looking. And he twice found pieces while camera crews were rolling on him.
He had the one with the four-wheeler. The four-wheeler.
Yeah. He was driving around a four-wheeler with a camera crew, and there's a piece. And meanwhile, you've got sort of like annual beach cleanups in South Africa where like you've got 10,000 people, searching cleaning up debris from the beach, gunk and junk from the beach, and they've got, been handed flyers saying keep an eye out for aircraft debris. None of them ever find anything. Some people accidentally find pieces on the African coast and in other islands, but nobody from Blaine ever finds. So I'm saying this sounds kind of suspicious to me. But
sure it does.
Again, and the other thing about Blaine's pieces is that unlike the flatbron and some of the other pieces that turned up, all of his pieces are like suitcase size or less, like you could fit it in a suitcase. And none of them, I've talked at length about the Lepus barnacles, none of his pieces have any marine life on them. And I spent a lot of time talking to people who study how organisms colonize things that float through the ocean. And pretty much, if you put something in the ocean, and if you've ever owned a boat, I think you'll know what I'm talking about. You don't put something in the ocean and expect it to remain clean.
No.
It's a very relentless process why gunk gets on your thing. And barnacles, there's all kinds of hydrozoans and various other entities that will attach algae and so forth.
There's a reason that I live in Madeira Beach, Florida, so I'm
Uh,
surrounded by salt water. There's a reason that people who own boats have winches to lift their boats out of the water after they take them out in the Gulf, because if you leave your boat sitting in there all the time, it'll be trashed in no time.
yeah. And so now a piece that floats across the ocean is going to come to shore covered in stuff. And if it washes up at a high tide and ends up on this sort of, beyond the fringe of dried up seaweed, it'll get picked over by crabs and seagulls, and it'll get cleaned up. And eventually what you get is, and if you've ever beachcombed or anything, you'll be familiar with it looks. It looks like it's been kind of bleached by the sun, kind of almost sandblasted by the elements. Everything looks kind of pale. And then if there's another high tide, that thing, which has been stripped clean, can be washed back out to sea and then washed back in. So it's not impossible for pieces to cross the ocean and get discovered on the other side with nothing on them. But it requires a kind of a fairly, three-stage process to occur. And you expect it to happen like once in a while, but not most of the time. And also, a lot of the stuff that was discovered, frankly, it looked like this piece had just come out of a box. This stuff looks very, some of them look completely like you'd expect. Some of them look completely covered over in gunk. But some of them look like they just came out of a box. And so
this guy that could possibly, we don't know, nobody's seen him do it or anything.
Right.
Maybe might have been planting debris just to get
Right.
attention to himself.
Right.
So there's that possibility that we have to be very, very open-minded to.
But
where was this stuff being found? Was it in the places that you would expect if the plane crashed in the South Indian Ocean?
Yes and no. Yes, this is exactly where you'd expect the pieces to be. In fact, Blaine went to an oceanographer in Australia who was working with the search authorities, and he said, "Where should I look?" And the guy said, "You should look on the coast of Mozambique." So he went to the coast of Mozambique, and 20 minutes later, he finds his first piece. That's pretty cool. But there was something problematic, which is that the oceanographers spent a long time trying to figure out how will these pieces, where would a plane have to crash such that the pieces would wind up where they were found when they were found. And not too long ago, an organization called CSIRO published a paper where they went into enormous depths, and they actually made models of the flaperon, put them in the ocean, watched them float, looked at how they stuck out, see how the wind took them. They looked at satellite data that showed them like to within the centimeter how high the sea levels were, so how the water would have flowed. And they were able to determine that the plane, that the flaperon could only have wound up on Reunion Island if it entered the water at about 35 degrees south latitude. Now, this is north of the area that they wound up spending most of their time looking in. Mm-hmm. And so the authorities in Australia are now essentially saying, we think we know where the plane is. It must be at 35 degrees south latitude, which is a little bit further north than we spent most of our time looking. What they don't say is that they actually did spend a fair amount of time looking at 35 degrees south. In fact, they searched it out to about 20 nautical miles in either direction. Now, as I said earlier in our discussion, that the BTO values are accurate to about plus or minus 10 kilometers, which is about 5 or 6 miles. And so they've searched to within what I would consider a reasonable distance of where a plane in a high-speed descent would have been found. And so I'm skeptical that to me, that what they're saying is that our whole story doesn't make any sense.
Now, there's the other part of this about the flaperon, and then also about you had a post on your site just very recently that the flaperon and then this part that the hinges were missing. This is not how you would expect these parts to break off
Right.
in your usual type of airplane crash, whether on land or in the ocean.
Yeah, exactly. I talked to a guy I talked to a couple of guys actually who their job is to look at aircraft debris from plane crashes and see what it can tell them about how the plane came to its demise. And basically, there's various ways that things can break, and the most relevant for our present discussion is compression failure and tension, which is something when something's pulled apart. And compression is when if you step on an egg, that's compression failure. And now you can imagine if a plane smashes into a surface like the ocean or land, it's going to be like getting hit by a hammer. You're going to see a lot of compression failure, especially on the front of the plane. Things can get kind of sideways ripped off in a way that looks like a tension failure. What's really peculiar is that all of the pieces that were found, with one exception, all of the pieces that were found came apart by tension failure.
And what would be a tension failure? What would be a good example for your average person of tension failure?
Breaking a string, pulling a string apart. Okay. Or if say you've got a plane and you want to pull a piece off it with a crane or something. Imagine grabbing a piece of a wing and ripping it off.
Okay.
That would be a tension failure. So that also raised questions, and a little bit more about the drift analysis. They were able to convince themselves that there was a certain way that it could get from the BTO arc to Reunion Island if it started at this such and such a place. But if it went into that place, all of the other debris didn't really make any sense. It should have arrived there much sooner. And you also would have expected to find pieces washing up in Australia, which never happened. And so collectively, when you look at all of the data together about the debris, and you factor in all the fact that they spent $150 million searching the seabed and it wasn't there, what you're left with is a whole bunch of data that doesn't make any sense. It does not add up. There's no coherent story. And I've talked to numerous people who are attached or some way affiliated with the official search, and they'll tell you there is no story that we can tell that fits with the data that we have. Now, to their mind, what that means is we just don't know what happened. But we do know that it went into the southern Indian Ocean. We just can't figure out what happened. But we've been baffled before. Air France 447, until they found it, everyone was kind of scratching their heads. They couldn't really figure out what happened. So a lot of people will just tell you, we don't know what happened. Whereas I will say, I take all of this failure of the evidence to jibe with each other as evidence that the entire scenario was wrong.
I have to agree with you.
Yeah, well,
I have to agree with you. And we should remind maybe the listeners, in the Flight 447, the Air France crash, that was caused by, I guess what you would say, by pilot error. And that plane hit the ocean very hard, and there were pieces all over the Atlantic Ocean, big pieces.
Yeah.
That is not what happened in Flight 370.
Yeah, no, it was quite far out at sea, and yet when they went to look for pieces from the air, they found a lot of them. Mm-hmm. And now it is possible. It actually didn't hit the plane. It didn't hit the water that hard. It was going like 150 miles an hour, which is way too fast to be survivable. But planes can hit harder. I mean, German wings, which happened also in 2014 was.
I thought that was 2015.
Sorry, 2015. It was soon after the anniversary of MH370. That hit the mountain going like, I don't know, 400 or 500 miles an hour, and that was like, the pieces were much tinier. And so a lot of people were saying, well, maybe it hit so hard that the pieces were too tiny that it couldn't be seen. But the point just being that it hasn't been unfolding the way you would expect a normal, quote unquote, normal accident to unfold.
And that kind of takes us to this. Let's talk about a little bit of scenarios, and I just want to ask you some things as we go through this. You
Sure.
pose a scenario, and I don't know if we want to get deep into the weeds with this, but you propose a scenario where the plane could have been taken over, much like you mentioned earlier, where somebody could have gotten down into the electronics bay and taken over the plane to the point where the pilots wouldn't be able to do anything. They could be sitting in the cockpit, messing around with the rudder, with the thrusters. Just nothing would be happening.
Right.
Maybe talk about that a little bit more and talk about how you mentioned earlier how difficult that would be. It would be like landing somebody on the moon.
Yeah. So yeah, once you get into the electronics bay, you've got, the 777 was the first fly-by-wire airplane that Boeing built, which means that instead of, the controls being connected to wires, connecting to push rods, physically moving the control surfaces, the pilots were telling the computer what they wanted, and then the computer was then sending information to the actuators that were moving the control surfaces. So if you have control of the computer, you have control of the plane. And you also have control of these computers that control the communications.
And you have control over the oxygen system in the plane.
Yeah, there's actually a valve that you can turn off oxygen to the cockpit, so that you could conceivably depressurize the plane and suffocate the pilots. And what was really interesting to me when I started to think about whether the question was, is it possible that the plane didn't go south? And it turned out that there is a way that it could have been done, under certain under certain circumstances. It would have to be a certain kind of plane. It would have to be a Boeing, not an Airbus. It would have to be a 777, not a 757. It could be a 787, but it couldn't be one of the earlier models. It had to be flying a certain kind of route. It had to have a certain kind of Inmarsat subscription. It had to be flying in a region underneath a certain, one of a few Inmarsat satellites, but not others. Everything had to line up for this alternate explanation to be possible. And it was very curious to me that MH370 fit all of them.
I mean, you start getting like down 1 out of 100 to 1 out of
Yeah.
1,000 to 1 out of 10,000 to 1 out of 100,000. I mean, the odds,
Right.
it's just one particular plane on a particular day
Right.
would have been ripe for this kind of scenario. And
Right.
as I have in my notes here, I start thinking about this. To me, what you're talking about, this is something that would have had to have been practiced beforehand. I mean, if we're going to talk about the moon landing, remember how many times we went to the moon before we actually landed on it. There were practice runs, and we did practices out in the desert and things. And I even have in my notes, like when the SEALs went to get bin Laden, that was something
Right.
that had to be planned, and they had a mock-up of the compound and everything. And even that didn't go as they planned. I mean, they lost a helicopter over there. But in this particular circumstance, it seemingly they got everything right. I mean,
Yeah. Well, they got everything right, but it would be, like I said, I mean, from the very beginning, it seemed to me that if something like this occurred, we're clearly talking a state level undertaking. Like I said, it's like equivalent to putting a man on the moon almost. And yeah, how did they know it didn't go wrong? Wasn't going to go wrong. And the answer to that is we wouldn't know. You don't know. We're not. All we see is the end result. We don't see how it was planned, or if it was planned, or how they came up with it, or anything. And remember, at this point, this is conjectural, because
Sure.
I don't have any smoking gun proof. I have a lot of what I feel is pretty compelling circumstantial evidence.
Yeah.
But the question is, okay, if the plane isn't in the southern Indian Ocean, where else could it possibly be? And the answer is I feel like there's only one answer. You hear a lot of people parenthetically saying, "Oh, well, there were some villagers in the Maldives said that they saw this other plane. It must have gone to the Maldives." That's impossible. It's impossible knowing what we know about the science of Inmarsat data and what the plane, where the data that we have came from. Now, some people think, oh, the whole thing was just a cooked up hoax, like the fake moon landing.
Yeah.
like the fake Twin Towers bombing.
Yeah, of course.
Well, if you're going to go to that level, then there's no point in having a discussion at
No,
all.
no, right,
Um,
right.
but so anyway, yeah, you're absolutely right. Like this is like a Bin Laden raid. This is like that abortive raid to rescue the hostages from Tehran. How do
Sure,
you know that
sure.
something this complicated and ambitious isn't going to go wrong? And if it goes wrong, think about the embarrassment that the horror
That's right.
of embarrassment. But so yeah, I mean, there's a lot of reasons why this would not be a good idea. And one of the things people always tell me, the first question many people ask me is, what's the motive for taking this plane? And my answer, well, I try to explain what I think the motive could be, but my first answer is, I'm trying to tell you how the plane could not be in the Southern Indian Ocean. Like if it's not there, this other thing had to have happened. And whether this other thing was a good idea or well motivated, I can't say that.
Motive is not an element of a crime. All you have to do is prove that, like in this show, Unfound, we do mostly missing people. That's all we do. But it's more,
right,
crime.
right,
Somebody, a crime of passion, a crime of opportunity. And although we like to talk about the motive, all you have to do is figure out the DNA, the fingerprints, the video cameras, things like that. Motive is just something, it's good for theories. And that's
right.
essentially what you're saying, too, is that you have all of this data. You don't have to worry about the motive necessarily.
Well, I'm really glad to hear you say that, because that's a point that really many people don't get. They say, I don't understand the motive for this, therefore I'm going to stop listening. And in fact, Richard Quest said that to me on CNN. He's like, "What's the motive?" And I tried to explain it to him, but he's like, "I don't see the motive. I don't think this happened." But you're right. I mean, if I have 12 young boys buried under my basement, it doesn't matter that there's no plausible motive for me to do that.
The only
I
point is that you did it.
I did it.
Yeah.
Right? It certainly looks bad. It doesn't look good. So yeah, the fact that I'm a nice guy who wouldn't harm a fly, and everyone, and I, contribute to the local, Shriners Fund or whatever. Yeah. So yeah, that's the point I guess I was trying to make. That yeah, let's not worry about motive. Let's look at what actually happened.
Right. The other point, though, to to talk about this, though, and you say state sponsored. I think that we, can give this away. That maybe let's say that if Russia was involved, and
Right.
I had pointed out that 60% of the passengers on Flight 370 were Chinese. And I just have a scenario. Well, what happens if it doesn't work? What happens if there are Russians on this plane? They try to take over the plane. They don't succeed. Something goes wrong. And the plane is either it's crashed in the South China Sea or somewhere where it could be accessed. You get to the black boxes and you figure out that these Russians tried to take over the plane and tried to do something with it. That seems like something that could be pretty explosive if it blew up between China
Yeah.
and Russia. I mean, there's a huge risk there if it was state sponsored. Now, if it's just a few guys just doing this for kicks, that's something else. But if it
Right.
is state sponsored, I mean, that could really be trouble.
So what you would need is, yeah, I mean, listen, absolutely. But let me back up a little bit. Why Russia? So, like I said, we talked about the two kinds of data. The BFO data can be spoofed in a way I've been kind of loosely alluding to. The BTO data there is no real known mechanism by which the BTO data could be faked. And as I said, the authorities, because they learned not to rely on the BFO, they came up with an alternate method to come up with where the plane would have gone, just based on BTO data and using some fancy statistical tricks. And it turns out that the plane, based on their analysis, if it went north, would have gone to Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan is a close ally of Russia, and really because like you mentioned, the sophistication of the attack, this sort of moon landing level of ambition, you'd have to have an aircraft industry, you'd have to have a satellite communications industry, you'd have to have such deep level knowledge of these things that you really need like either a Russia or like United States, Great Britain, France, Germany, you Sweden, you need a kind of like top tier level country. And so to get to your point about like, okay, this is a crazy war crime,
I'm just thinking about if it doesn't succeed. I mean,
right.
what the
So
fallout could be.
again, yeah, and so yeah, you'd have to say, who is willing to kill a large number of civilians of a country that they're not at war with, for what? For what? For a motive that is utterly opaque, and which I would agree, like that is a big problem for my theory. Until 4.5 months later, another Malaysian Airlines 777, one of only 15, well, there were 15 Malaysian Airlines 777s at the start of 2014. There were 13 at the end of 2014, because two of them and this is, I mean, first of all, the 777 is a very safe airplane. They'd never been lost in flight before. And you have this one Malaysian Airlines 777 disappearing, and then 4.5 months later, this plane is flying over eastern Ukraine, and it gets shot down. And now at first, and everyone's like, oh my God, this is a terrible tragedy. This is, no, again, what's the motive for someone deliberately doing this? There's no obvious motive for someone doing this. And it's very quickly become, and this is like a whole nother, we could spend a whole nother hour talking about this. But to make a long story short, it turns out that the Russians sent a Buk missile launcher across the border the night before. It parked in this field directly under the path of that MH17 was scheduled to fly, waited till the plane was almost overhead, shot it down, killed almost 300 people. That evening, they put the missile launcher back on a truck. It goes back across the border, back to the missile brigade that it came from. So you have essentially a chain of command responsibility, because this is not some rogue militiamen who accidentally got their hands on a missile and fired it off not knowing what they were doing, and by an incredible stroke of luck. By the way, we mentioned the 1 in 1,000 chance that the plane, that MH370 just happened to be the kind of plane whose BFO you could spoof.
Yeah.
But now you've got a 1 in 18,000 chance that the second plane to come to grief also happens to be Malaysian Airlines 777. And you've got chain of command responsibility for the destruction of another plane full of passengers that's also attended by all kinds of fake theories that are being floated by the Russians that are ludicrous, including doctored photos and, ginned up tests by the maker of the missile. And, it's like MH370 in so many regards, except it's much more obvious what happened. And in part, it's obvious what happened because of a really novel and quite ingenious detective methodology that was pioneered by an outfit called Bellingcat, which is really an English guy named Elliot Higgins and his online cohort. And they were able to very meticulously go through social media posts online and of things like dash cam videos and people's photos, because people noticed that this rocket launcher was going through their village, and which had never had before, and they took pictures and posted it, and they basically were able to piece together how this thing traveled from Russia to Ukraine and back, and they were able to identify the perpetrator, the people in the unit, the name of the unit, pictures of people in the unit, even the officer that was in charge of the shoot down. And it's now going to go to trial at some point. It's a very long process. So you have not only this the case of a horrible act without any clear motive, in which citizens of innocent citizens are killed, but also the attendant kind of fog of obscuration of these theories. Now, one of the things is, if you follow MH370 at all, you're well aware that there's like a million theories, most of which seem completely crazy.
Yes.
And again, with MH17, without any real reason for them to be theories, there's been this proliferation of theories. Oh, the Americans shot it down, the Ukrainians shot it down, and fake evidence. And we've seen that same thing with MH370. So these, to me, really seem like sister incidents where there's so much that's eerily similar between them.
Okay. Would you say that Flight 370 is the greatest mystery of the 21st century so far?
I wouldn't limit it to that. I mean, I would say it's the greatest aviation mystery, hands down, ever. And and I mean, by a country mile. And I wonder if it's just the greatest mystery ever, because and if what I'm saying is true, and the way I see it, that with every wave of new information we get, any other explanation seems increasingly remote. If it's not only the greatest mystery in terms of like the most compelling and most baffling and so forth, but it's also the most important in that it was a mystery that was created to be a mystery. It was created to be confounding and baffling and attention diverting. It took place in order to divert attention from Crimea, which had been annexed by Russia the day before. And it was, I think, maybe perhaps a show of prowess to show the West what Russia was capable of at a time when Russia was held in very low esteem, frankly. Obama dismissed Russia as a world power. He said they were only a regional power. And when Vladimir Putin attended the G20 summit that year, he was a pariah. He was dismissed and ridiculed. At the G20 summit this year, he was the focus of attention. Russia, in the wake of MH370, you had a slowly dawning realization amongst policymakers in the West that Russia was a real threat and that it was waging this kind of a campaign of aggression on many, many fronts, not only in terms of military power in Ukraine and Syria, but also this kind of these troll armies that were attempting to influence public opinion.
If you hit Powerball, like there was that Powerball that was like $1 billion like a year and a half ago, or you were put in charge of the search and everything right now, what would you do? What would you do, Jeff?
You're saying if I had all the money in the world, or if I could just do whatever?
Yeah, well, if you were in charge of the search, being that the search has been done, nothing has been found. They're trying to figure out, where do we go next? What do we do next? What would you do if you were in charge?
I would, and I think it's not so unrealistic. I think there should be like a public some kind of conference or public forum where people can come and really, I would love to just sit down with the people running the investigation and say, look, here's my concerns. Here are the points that I've raised. What are your answers to these points? And let's, and then from an intelligence perspective, I think I've identified some loose ends that could easily be chased down by people who had the means to carry out a serious intelligence operation.
How much of your resources, whatever it would be, say if they decide we're going to spend another $150 million to do whatever, how much of that do you think should be devoted to continuing searching of the Indian Ocean? Do you think that's fruitful or anything?
I don't think any money should be spent searching the Southern Indian Ocean. I think they've done a pretty good job establishing that it's not there. I feel like the Australians are making a claim that they've identified this area where it must be. Only because otherwise it would just be too embarrassing. If they wanted to say, okay, like let's reopen the search, let's search this 25,000 square kilometers, I would say, fine, go ahead and do that. If that's going to at least, if you will then say that the absence of the plane is a real problem for your model. I was happy for them to. I said I don't think you're going to find a plane in the Southern Indian Ocean, but I was happy for them to do it because I actually somewhat naively expected that, having looked there and not found it, they would go back and say, okay, let's talk to the guy who said we're not going to find it, and let's go look at what he was saying. They've obviously been unwilling to do that. But you don't have to spend another $150 million. I don't think you have to even spend $1 million. But I think if you could allocate some resources to looking at what you've already got. Listen, this whole narrative, to me, the mystery of MH370 is really two mysteries, or two huge challenges. The first challenge is to figure out what the data means. And then the second data is to convince anyone of what the data means. It's a battle. We're in an era of battling narratives, but we live in one contiguous reality. If a tree falls in the woods and it's captured by scientific instruments, then the fall of that tree is a real and actual event. And for people to say, well, I have alternate facts, or I have some, once you get into the fog, and as I said, this is really important. The fog is not an unfortunate thing that has sprung up around MH370 and MH17. But the fog, in my view, is an integral part of the mystery. And the
It's on
fog,
purpose. It's on purpose.
it's yes. Once you have the fog, you have no longer a coherent reality that you can use science to tangle with. And anything can happen. But essentially, you have gotten away with it. What I'm alluding to is the Chewbacca. You're familiar with the Chewbacca defense?
No.
The Chewbacca defense is a very funny episode of South Park, where this kind of Johnny Cochran figure is like, basically it's a parody of the O.J. Simpson trial, where you have a guy who's caught completely dead to rights. His blood is all over the crime scene. He clearly killed his wife. He's guilty of sin. So that you can't defend a guy on the facts. So what you do is you undermine the validity of the facts, and so the Chewbacca defense is like, why? He starts talking about, was Chewbacca a bear? Was Chewbacca like a giant rabbit? And he's like, why? And then, well, why am I even talking about Chewbacca? Chewbacca has nothing to do with this case. The whole nothing makes any sense. And so the fog is basically the Chewbacca defense. It's like you're talking about, we're talking about the fact that no facts are reliable. And this is a case where basically civilization cannot endure, because your podcast is about criminal justice. It's about solving crimes, and it's about a sense of establishing what happened and who's responsible.
Sure.
If there is no such thing as a shared reality, if there's no such thing as facts, then justice is impossible.
I will agree with that.
So I say, whenever you see the fog, the tendrils of the fog lapping around, you see the Chewbacca defense being raised. So this is basically the two twin. I sometimes think of it. If you've ever climbed up a hill or a mountain, you're trying to get to the top of the mountain. There's often a sensation where you feel like, okay, I'm just at the top of the mountain. I can see there's no more trees, there's no more ground. I'm going to come over that little rise, and then I'm going to be at the top. And then you get to that place, and you realize, oh no, there's a whole nother thing I have to go up. That's what MH370 was for me. It's like, I got to the top of the mountain, and I'm like, oh my God, there's an even huger mountain on top of this mountain. The first mountain being, what does the data tell us about what happened to the plane? And then the second part is, how do I fight through this crazy fog? And talking to you today is hopefully one step up that second mountain, trying to bring to the public the understanding of what happened and why the plane's mystery is so baffling. It's not just because the evidence is so hard to understand. I think actually the evidence isn't that hard to understand. But it's been layered in so many layers of misunderstanding, misinformation, and misportrayal, which I hasten to add is at least hugely a flaw of the media and a flaw of the public.
Jeff, you were talking about the fog, specifically the Australians. We see them as an ally. We see their country as being very much like the United States in a lot of ways. Would you say that they are in the fog right now? Would you say that maybe it's like willingly denying that there are other possibilities? How do you view it at this point?
I think that I've talked to some of the people involved, and I've been very impressed by the Australians overall. I think they've done a really crackerjack job of getting involved into some really quite esoteric scientific aspects of the case. And I think they're just really hardworking, and they've been very open. They've been really, I just think, great. Now, they haven't found the plane, and I think that they have sort of fallen victim to, if this was a deception, it was a very sophisticated deception, and I think they just have underestimated the potential of their rivals, if that's indeed what it is. So I don't fault them, really. I just think that they fell victim to a very sophisticated ruse.
Okay. Do you see them coming out of that at some point, or do you think they're just going to say, well, we just can't find a plane and that's it?
Unfortunately, I think it's the latter. I think it's gonna take someone finding a real smoking gun evidence of what happened to the plane before they change their minds. And I feel like there already is smoking gun evidence of what happened to the plane. I feel that the inconsistencies in the flaperon, maybe in retrospect, people will say, oh yeah, that was clearly wrong. But sometimes it takes more evidence than you think.
Right. Right. What does your gut tell you? Do you think that there are people high up in the intelligence services of the United States, the NSA, CIA, whoever else, that they actually do know, but they can't release to the public, or what? Do you think that not only as let's say it was the Russians or somebody like that, do you think that they've successfully fooled everybody, or there are some people in some certain positions in other countries, maybe the United States, that actually know what happened and just can't go on the record?
If I had to choose one or the other, I'd say that they probably do know, but that I have no evidence for that. It just seems they. It would be too depressing to think that
Okay.
that if the Russians took it, that the Americans would have completely missed it even after I wrote my book.
Okay. Okay. Speaking of your book, once again, it's called The Plane That Wasn't There. You have two other books, Extreme Fear, and then another book regarding the German Wings
Right,
pilot who committed suicide, killed all those people in
right.
2015. Just tell the listeners a little bit about those two books. Extreme Fear first, if you could.
Yeah, the book is called Extreme Fear: The Science of Your Mind in Danger, and it's about what happens to us mentally when we're in under extreme stress, we're in a life or death situation, or even when we're in sort of feeling social anxiety or having a panic attack. It all relates to the same psychological system. A lot of aviation examples, people saving their plane with seconds to spare. And then I also came out with another book in 2015, a Kindle single called Fatal Descent. It's the story of Andreas Lubitz and Germanwings 9525, the guy who committed suicide by flying his Airbus into the Alps.
And what would be a summary of obviously there's not much of a mystery there, unless you listen to his parents who think that he didn't do it, which I'm
Yeah,
sure that is not the position you're taking. But what would you say the summary of that book would be?
the summary of the book would basically that Andreas Lubitz suffered from depression, and that he was suffering these psychosomatic symptoms. That oftentimes depression manifests as a physical illness, and he basically decided to take his life because he didn't understand what was happening to him, and he had kind of led this very high pressured failure is not an option kind of upbringing, and he just didn't really have the psychological tools to deal with it. So it's a tragedy, and actually not unlinked to MH370. He was after his death, his iPad was found to have he'd searched for information about MH370, and specifically the theory that the pilot committed suicide. That remains the sort of most plausible mainstream theory about MH370.
Right. Yeah, we didn't even talk about the pilots themselves and everything, but people, of course, can read about that in your book, The Plane That Wasn't There. In fact, the people should know, I've listened to Jeff's book twice, and probably in our discussion, we've only covered maybe 50% of what is in his
Yeah.
book. So I would urge you to go out, get the audio book, get the print book, whatever you can. It's an excellent read. It really is. And I haven't read the other two, but I'm going to take for granted they're just as good. Maybe I should ask you this. One more thing about pilots and suicide. That happens probably more than people realize. I mean, it's not a common occurrence, but I think of the Egypt air crash, the Silk air crash. Of course, those countries dispute those were suicides, but the NTSB, you listen to them, they'll tell you that those were pilot suicides.
Yeah, there's a pretty compelling case in each of those, and it's not a verdict. It's a verdict that people push back against. As you mentioned, Andreas Lubitz's parents also dispute that. But you have a handful of cases, you know, uh, and it's really people can do very strange things, but they also tend to fall within certain parameters. Like I said, they do tend to have to be quick.
Right.
It's not something that you would generally like say, given a choice between flying it into a mountain or flying it into the ground, or like flying out over the open ocean until it runs out of fuel. Just doesn't seem very plausible.
Right.
Very plausible.
Where can people find you, Jeff? You have a Facebook page. I know you have your website. Tell the listeners about all of that, please,
Yeah,
please.
I've got a Facebook page called the Jeff Wise Scribatorium. Most of what I do, though, I do on my own webpage, which is jeffwise.net. And I would strongly urge anyone who's at all interested in this to come. And there's a kind of an ongoing discussion. I post every couple of weeks or something. I put up what I'm always working on something about this case, putting up the latest and letting people pick it over and discuss. And if people have new theories or new insights, I'm happy to put up as a guest post. But there's a sort of I've got 40,000 comments or something over the last 3 years where people are kind of weighing in. So it's a real lively, active discussion. And
It is.
It helped. I mean, I think every single person that comes and kind of throws in their 2 cents, it makes a difference.
Do you have a Facebook page or anything like that? Are you on Twitter? Do you do that? Any of that?
I tweet under the handle of Man v Brain.
Man versus Brain. Interesting.
Yeah, that's my next project that I'm hoping to get underway about why we struggle. It's sort of a spin-off of the Fear book. Why do we struggle with ourselves when we're trying to be brave, and then kind of opening it up into why do we struggle with all the other things we struggle with, trying to eat right and exercise and save money, and it seems like life can be a struggle.
Okay.
Why is that? So Man v Brain, but then I mentioned my Facebook page is called the Jeff Wise Scribatorium. I think if you just search Jeff Wise on Facebook,
we'll find all of that.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Any final words, Jeff?
Well, listen, like I said, I mean, I feel that, we all want to solve the mystery, but it's more about cutting through the fog. And I appreciate your having me on to hopefully do that.
You're welcome, Jeff. And I appreciate you being on this episode of Unfound.
My pleasure.
And that was my interview with Jeff Wise, aviation expert and author of The Plane That Wasn't There. As I stated in the interview, we only covered about 50% of what's in the book. We didn't talk about the pilots themselves, we just ran out of time. Both of them have gotten a lot of attention, with the captain being suspected of doing the hijacking on his own. We didn't talk about how a plane could travel over countries such as Malaysia, India, Pakistan, etc., without being intercepted, if in fact it went to a country like Kazakhstan. We didn't talk about some of the more advanced technological aspects of what could be the greatest mystery of modern civilization. This and more is what you'll find in Jeff's excellent book, along with longer explanations of the topics touched upon in the interview. It's worth a read, even if you're not into aviation mysteries and accidents like I am. And I should state that no matter if you believe Jeff's theory or somebody else's theory regarding the disappearance of Flight 370, this isn't necessarily about the disappearance of a plane. Planes are manufactured every day. This disappearance is about the 100-some families who have no answers at this point, over 3 years later. So I'd just like to leave you with a couple points before I conclude this episode. First, what I mentioned at the beginning, about being stubborn and ignoring facts that are right in front of our eyes. And this is in reference to myself and how I've changed my mind. Back in March 2014, being the air crash enthusiast that I am, I quickly made up my mind. I thought the pilot was ticked off about the politics in Malaysia, had some kind of psychotic break, and flew the plane into the Indian Ocean, killing himself and the passengers. And I can specifically remember reading Jeff Wise's stuff back then and rejecting it. Now, he's on Unfound talking about his suspicions, and I'm agreeing with him. It took a while for me to come around. Granted, I'm not saying Jeff is right. We don't know if he's right or not. But what's very clear is the other experts, those believing in the Indian Ocean crash theory, aren't as correct as they portrayed themselves back in 2014 and 2015. So they should be held accountable. And they should have to explain why they were so sure, but nothing has been found. The families deserve an explanation for that. Somebody needs to be held accountable as to that $150 million that was spent that proved nothing. The second point. I think at some time there will be no more data to analyze. In fact, I think the investigators have already reached that time. It's not like suddenly out from the sky a satellite is going to beam down more info about MH370. So it may be time to turn to the human side of this, and Jeff talks about this a little bit in his book. But what I mean by it is this: how many people in the world could have known that you may be able to spoof data from a jet plane? Sure, now the theory is out there, and a lot of people can visualize how to do it. But back at that time, 2013 into early 2014, how many people could have known how to do that? Less than 100? So I'd start at Boeing. How many people there knew that satellite information could be spoofed or faked? Then I'd go to their contractors who supply all of their computer equipment. How many people in those companies knew that satellite information could be spoofed or faked? Then I'd go to the satellite company Inmarsat. How many people there knew that satellite data could be spoofed or faked? I'm going to guess in 2013 into 2014 it was very, very few people. Because if the Russians are involved, or any other country, Iran, North Korea, whoever, they wouldn't take the time to learn how to do this from scratch. Why do that when they could pay somebody to teach them? They'd go about finding a loose link in Boeing's chain and exploit it. Somebody with a gambling habit. Somebody with an axe to grind. No different than how countries spy on each other already. That's where I'd be going. So although the ultimate answer may lie in Russia or some other country, the easiest way to investigate this is by starting with Boeing itself. I'll add something else. All you have to do is look at all of the military hardware in China now that looks so much like Boeing equipment to know that the company doesn't protect its secrets very well. One more reason I'd start there. And with that, I'll leave the rest of the theorizing up to you. And that's the program. If you found it informative, please go to iTunes and give Unfound a 5-star review. I thank you for listening. I'll leave the rest of the theorizing up to you. And that's the program. If you found it informative, please go to the app that you use to listen to Unfound and give this podcast a nice review. I thank you for listening. I'm Ed Dentzel, and you've been listening to Unfound.